In 1575, the forces of Takeda Katsuyori faced off against the forces of the Oda and the Tokugawa clans, and the famous Battle of Nagashino saw Oda gunners mow down wave after wave of Takeda cavalry. The slaughter was so pervasive that the samurai collectively gave up their firearms, with the result that they stopped improving them, stopped importing them, and when the Americans arrived in 1858, the Japanese realized they were drastically outmatched. At least, that's the popular understanding. But it's actually not true. So where does this idea come from, and what's really the case? Well, the answer is that this largely appears to have entered the minds of the general public who are enthusiastic about all things samurai due to the publication in 1979 of a book, Giving Up the Gun, Japan's Reversion to the Sword, 1543 to 1879. Written by an American academic and essayist named Noel Perrin. The thesis is that the Japanese renounced firearms, seeing them as too fearsome as a weapon, and that the Japanese population was disarmed via the famous sword hunts of Toyotomi Hideyoshi, which attempted to disarm both the peasantry and the ronin, the masterless wandering samurai. This is, however, not the case. The book makes this argument because it was attempting to create a polemic for nuclear disarmament during the Cold War. If the Japanese could see how deadly matchlocks were and renounce them in the name of peace, then so too could the USSR and the USA renounce nuclear weapons. Perrin's argument, however, does contain a kernel of truth. The sword hunts did attempt to collect the weapons of segments of the Japanese population during the Sengoku Jidai, and Hideyoshi's 1588 sword hunt is probably the most well known. But the peasants and the ronin were not completely disarmed. Indeed, the Sengoku Jidai is often referred to as the Age of the Iki, alliance networks of villages and lower-ranking samurai who signed oaths of allegiance to each other, with their names often signed in a circular fashion so that no one individual was above the other. Those contracts, especially if they were religious in nature, were burned, the ashes mixed with water, and consumed in a process known as tasting the gods' water. This was the dominant system of societal organization during this period, the Iki, not anything resembling what we might understand to be feudalism. In fact, specialists on the Sengoku Jidai and even the preceding Muromachi and Kamakura periods don't utilize it as a descriptive term for Japanese society at all. So in order to be effective in defending their territory, the Iki were often heavily armed, villages often had their own militaries, and they often had firearms. And the Japanese do indeed stop innovating in firearms technology. There is actually one point in the 16th century when you can make a very strong argument that the Japanese had the most technologically advanced firearms out of any culture on the planet. But they don't stop innovating and improving their guns because of the slaughter at the Battle of Nagashino. We're not even sure how the firearms were deployed at that battle. We have three main sources for it, all written well after the battle, two of which state that the Oda forces shot off their guns but which disagree on the number of troops, and one of which states that there were about 3,000 gunners who quote-unquote took their turn at fire. That could possibly mean the gunners rotated. You'll often see this in reenactments of the battle or in video games such as Shogun Total War. Or it could just mean that everyone shot firearms when they could. The literature is actually still unclear about how to interpret this particular phrase. Instead of reacting out of horror, the Japanese stopped developing firearm technology because there simply wasn't a need to anymore. Japan was under the control of the Tokugawa and at peace. Now, we do actually have military manuals and regulations issued by the Tokugawa shogunate requiring samurai to keep firearms and to practice regularly with them. So guns do continue into the 18th century. There is one instance of an attempt at regulation, however. In 1687, Tokugawa Tsuneyoshi attempted to restrict guns in Japan as part of his laws for the protection of animals. He is called the Dog Shogun for a very good reason, and the government does restrict guns within the city of Edo, modern-day Tokyo, but that was for reasons of security. The sale of guns and the use of guns by farmers and others never stopped. There are actually some 18th century records of Japanese villages containing more guns and ammunition than people. So, not only did the Japanese not forget their firearms, they continued in use right up until 1858, when the Americans arrived, and Japan was forever changed.